Earlier, we had talked about Du Bois and how he was challenging the narratives that tried to argue that African Americans were somehow biologically inferior. And I think he does that successfully in his works. I mean, he deals with the issues very well. There's also, though, this question of how do you apply that more directly to bring actual political change. Again, I'm not trying to take away from what Du Bois was doing. It's very important work. But it's a little bit more isolated, perhaps, than other things to contemporary realities. Right? Reconstruction had been over since 1877. Du Bois is writing in 1935. It's still important. I don't want to take away from that importance, but it's not as perhaps as direct and urgent as maybe some other issues. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think it'll be clear when we look at this man, John Hope Franklin, because Franklin was a African American historian, and he was also part Native American. I believe he was connected to the Choctaw, I believe, who was very interested in legal history. And because he was interested in legal history, he was called on to help form the case, and I believe also to testify in Brown versus Board of Education. So that's what I mean. Du Bois is doing very important work. Franklin is also doing very important work. It's just his is more connected to a particular political, social issue. But Franklin is interesting. He was from Oklahoma, and in a part because his family had connections. I mean, quite literally, his family included Native Americans as well as African Americans, and he himself was descended from both Native Americans and African Americans. He has that kind of background. And what's really important about his background was that there was a family history of law. This was in Oklahoma, and there were often attempts basically by, for example, oil companies to take advantage of Native Americans and secure oil rights to their land or to encroach on their land without any kind of agreement. And John Hope Franklin's father was a lawyer who would fight those claims on behalf of his Native American clients, and would also try and use the law to help bring about beneficial changes in terms of civil rights. And so it's no surprise, coming from a family of lawyers, that John Hope Franklin would become a legal historian. And then his research would be used in Brown versus Board of Education. If you're not familiar with that case, that was the case that struck down segregation in schools. The idea had been separate but equal, but of course it wasn't really separate but equal. And John Hope Franklin was one of many very important people, I think, who helped challenge that argument, and who, of course, eventually brought a legal victory, forcing through desegregation of schools. But what's key then here, right? You can see in John Hope Franklin this idea that historical truth could bring real improvement. Not necessarily in some kind of long-term way, not simply in some way of just getting people to change their minds. And those things are important, don't get me wrong. But in the idea of direct action, right? Testimony in a court case that leads to a court ruling, that leads to the ending of a great injustice, segregation of schools. So you can see how African American historiography is very much connected to the African American quest, and of course people who support that quest, who aren't African American, that quest for equality. Now, like I said, though, there's this problem. If you focus too much on injustice and suffering, that removes historical agency. So what happened was, in order to argue that in order to argue that segregated schools hurt African Americans, it was necessary to emphasize how harmed African Americans were. That African Americans were the subjects of great injustice and suffering, and this injustice needed to be dealt with. The problem is, and I want to stress that's absolutely necessary, you have to, in order to address an injustice, you have to show that it happened. But the problem is, if you focus only on the injustice, it removes African American historical agency if you go too far. If African Americans are only victims, not only is it inaccurate, but it just presents African Americans as, in a sense, as people who can't really do anything, who have no control. And it plays then into ideas of racial inferiority. Right? If African Americans do nothing but suffer injustice and are never able to take steps on their own to deal with that injustice, not only is that inaccurate, as we'll see, but it also makes African Americans into perpetual victims who can't really do anything to improve their own situation, and therefore plays into racial stereotypes of African Americans as somehow inferior. So there will be challenges to ideas that African Americans are simply victims. And I want to stress, I'm not saying that John Hope Franklin or anyone was saying that particularly. I'm just saying that this is a tension that you have to balance when you're writing an African American history. And I think a recognition of that can be seen of the work of Charles Quarles. And I wanted to stress, I did not make a mistake there. He lived a really long time. Quarles is another African American African American historian who wrote many books about African American history, but he wrote a fascinating book called Black Abolitionists. There was a tendency to focus in the history of abolitionism to focus on white abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison, Angelina Grimke, John Brown, and so forth. There was this, and maybe you'd give Frederick Douglass a little bit of attention, but they were the focuses. And we can, in a sense, we can understand historically why they were the focuses, because they had a lot of political power. Garrison was meeting with Lincoln, I think, relatively frequently. They were highly educated, and they left a lot of documentation. So they were often the focus. But what Quarles does is he looks at a lot of black abolitionists who were also very active. But because they maybe weren't alive during the Civil War, right? They were earlier, maybe because they were more locally oriented rather than nationally oriented. You know, William Lloyd Garrison, for example, his newspaper, The Liberator, had a national circulation. These were maybe people who were more active locally. They had been left out of the historical narrative. And the historical narrative was kind of like white abolitionists plus Frederick Douglass. And Quarles is going to challenge that and show, no, African Americans are active in searching for freedom. Right? African Americans are also abolitionists. In fact, in a sense, they're the first abolitionists. So this is really important. This is something we have to emphasize, right? This idea of showing agency. It's not that African Americans were waiting, in a sense, to be freed, and to be freed by white abolitionists. They were actively taking a role, working with white abolitionists to bring an end to slavery. It's important to remember that sense of agency. Now, what's also important, and it's key, when you look at history, you don't want to necessarily look at the earlier historians as wrong. You want to see how what happens is over time, historians help deepen and complicate our understanding. And a person who does that very well, I think, is a man named Eugene Genovese. Eugene Genovese is going to write a book called Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made. And in this book, he is going to complicate resistance. And he's going to look at this ideology of paternalism, which presented slave owners tried to present themselves as like the good fathers of the slaves, right? You know, just as a good father disciplines his children, I, the slave owner, I'm a good master. Slaves are kind of like kids. They're childlike. I'm a good father who takes care of them and disciplines them well. That was kind of the ideology behind slavery as a benign institution. And what Genovese does, he doesn't reject what Quarles is talking about. He doesn't say, oh, there were no black abolitionists. He doesn't do that. But what he wants to do is say, okay, I want to look a little bit more deeply about how slaves resisted slavery. So let me give you an example. In all of human history, there has been exactly one successful slave revolt. One. It's in Haiti. There's a lot of reasons why it was successful, whereas others were not, but there was only one. Slave revolts are therefore relatively rare. And when they did take off, they usually didn't last very long. And so if you only looked at slave revolts or the actions of abolitionists, it made it seem like there wasn't necessarily all that much resistance among African American slaves themselves. And what Genovese is trying to do is to show the different ways resistance could take place. So, for example, if you think about slave resistance, you might think of a slave revolt. But Genovese said, well, what if slaves refused to work? There were times when slaves would refuse to work. What if a slave pretends to be sick? What if a slave pretends to be kind of dumb and not to understand instructions? What if a slave purposely breaks tools but makes it look like an accident? What if slaves take food that they were supposed to turn over, they're harvesting grain? What happens if instead of giving it all to the master, putting it in there, they take some of it for themselves? Isn't that all acts of resistance? And in a sense, he's trying to broaden what resistance means. You could resist the institution of slavery itself to try and end it, but chances are that's not going to go well. The slave power, as the abolitionists would say, would be too strong. Right? Their slave revolts generally fail. If you're a slave and you try and just tell the master, well, I'm just not going to work today, things are not going to go well for you because of all the violence. But his point was slaves could resist in ways that maybe didn't threaten slavery directly, but made their lives a bit better in it. So like those examples I gave you. Well, I'm going to pretend to be kind of dumb, and I'm going to break my tools, or I'm going to do the job wrong. And because the ideology says that I'm not very smart, there's not a whole lot the slave owner can do. He may curse me for being dumb, but I'm just playing along with his ideology. So instead of resisting to end slavery, I'm trying to resist in a way to make my life a little bit better. Not having to work as hard so I can rest. So maybe I can try and get over the fact that I'm sick. Trying to get food I'm supposed to hand over to the master so I can get a little bit more food to eat so I can feed my family a bit better. Something like that. So, like I said, Genovese is trying to complicate how people resisted and what they were resisting for. And he's trying to do that in a way that would humanize slaves, right? That slaves are not simply people who just kind of sat there and were slaves. They're human beings trying to figure out how to live better lives in a terrible situation, right? And how they, and I want to stress this title, The World the Slaves Made. Trying to understand how they found dignity in their very difficult circumstances, which were designed to dehumanize them. And in a sense, asserting that dignity was an act of resistance. And to give you a further example of what he tried to do, remember, there's this idea of paternalism, right? The master is supposed to be the good father. The slave is like a child. So, children are kind of immature. They get angry. They don't always follow instructions. And you're supposed to discipline them in a kind, fatherly way. And so sometimes what slaves would do is they understood this ideology and they would pretend to play along with it in order to try and resist or to at least make their lives a little bit more bearable. Like I said, pretending not to understand instructions, accidentally breaking tools. All those things were acts of resistance, not so much at ending the institution because it just seemed too powerful, but were ways of trying to make your life a bit easier and to maintain your human dignity against terrible circumstances. And like I said, that's not saying that Quarles was wrong. He wasn't. But it's just trying to build on his work to say, let's look at different ways that enslaved people tried to resist as best they could and tried to maintain their human dignity. Now, I want to stress this work, very important work of African American historiography, is continuing on in different ways. So, for example, one way, of course, is how do you deal with this tension? How do we integrate the story of African Americans within a broader American history that values their accomplishments, that respects them and their community's achievements, while also recognizing them as full-fledged Americans who should be a part of the story? That makes a lot of sense. At the same time, you can also see works like that of Dr. Brenda Plummer. She wrote this book called In Search of Power, African Americans in the Era of Decolonization. So what happens then? You know, if you're African American, you're still saying there's some kind of connection with Africa, right? And you have people, in the sense, African Americans working for civil rights in the late 60s and early 70s. Of course, I mean, beyond that too, but that's just the period she's looking at. That's at the same time that Britain and France in particular are withdrawing their empires from Africa. So you have African Americans looking for civil rights at the same time that you have Africans in Africa looking for independence. And those things are kind of similar because both say, you know what? People of African descent, we're just as good as anyone else, right? We're not racially inferior. We can also organize our own governments, or we can also participate in the political process as equals. So this continues on, right? This kind of work figuring out, okay, how do we maintain a kind of communal identity while also integrating that both into the story of the United States and into a wider history of people who identify as African or as Black or however they want to identify. So very interesting stuff. In this lecture, we could really only scratch the surface, but hopefully it's given you some kind of understanding of African American historiography and what shapes it.